You're late again. What's your excuse?
Professor Whitfield,
15 minutes. You think this is some community college? Where you crawl in whenever you feel like it?
No, sir. My shift ran.
Your shift.
Whitfield laughed, dry.
That's the problem with affirmative action. They drag kids off loading docks. Shove them into seats they can't fill.
He tapped 2 problems on the chalkboard.
You want to stay in my class? Solve these. Up here. Now.
200 students watched. Nobody spoke. Samuel didn't know those problems had been unsolved for 20 years. What happened in the next 52 minutes is something this university has never been able to forget. Samuel Porter's alarm went off at 9:15 every night. Not in the morning, at night. That was when his second life started. He would roll off a twin mattress in a dorm room the size of a closet, lace up steel-toed boots that were 2 sizes too big because they were the only pair the warehouse had left, and catch the 9:40 bus to Henderson Distribution Center on the south side of the city. 12 miles from campus. A different world. Henderson moved freight for 3 major retail chains. The overnight crew loaded and unloaded containers from 10 at night until 5 in the morning. 7 hours. No breaks longer than 15 minutes. The pay was $14 an hour, and Samuel needed every cent of it. His scholarship covered tuition. Just tuition. Not the meal plan, not the dorm deposit, not textbooks, not the $200 a month he wired to his mother so she could keep the lights on back home. Dorothy Porter worked as a home health aide in a town called Ridgemont, population 11,000, median income barely clearing 30. She had raised Samuel alone since he was 4. His father left one morning and never explained why. There was no dramatic fight. No note, just an empty chair at breakfast and a woman who decided she would never let that absence define her son. Dorothy used to tell him one thing before bed every single night, no matter how tired she was. "You're gonna be something, baby. Don't let nobody tell you different." Samuel never forgot that. Not once. Not even on the nights when he couldn't feel his hands from stacking frozen freight in the cold dock. Samuel learned math the way some kids learn music. Not because anyone taught him, but because his brain just did it. Numbers made sense when nothing else did. When the rent was late and his mother cried in the kitchen at night, he would sit on the hallway floor with a pencil and a spiral notebook and work through whatever problem he could find. Division, fractions, later algebra, then calculus. Not because school required it, because it quieted something inside him. By the time he reached Whitmore University, he was the first person in his family to leave Ridgemont for anything other than a funeral. At the warehouse, nobody knew he was a math major. Nobody cared. He was just the quiet kid on Dock 4 who didn't complain and never called in sick. His supervisor, a thick-necked man named Gary, liked him because he moved boxes fast and didn't cause problems. Gary once told him, "You keep your head down, you'll move up to forklift in a year." He said it like it was a gift. Samuel smiled and said thank you. On his breaks, while the other guys smoked or scrolled their phones by the loading bay, Samuel sat on a stack of pallets under the fluorescent lights and solved equations. He used the back of shipping labels, the blank side where the adhesive hadn't reached. He carried them in his back pocket like other people carry cigarettes. One of the guys once picked up a label Samuel had left behind, stared at it, turned it sideways, said, "The hell is this? You writing in code?" Samuel shrugged. "Just homework." It wasn't homework. It was a proof he'd been working on for 3 weeks, an approach to a partitioning problem his professor had mentioned once in passing. The professor never followed up. Samuel couldn't stop thinking about it. He got back to the dorm at 5:30 each morning, showered, set an alarm for 8:15, slept 2 hours and 45 minutes, then walked to class. Most days he made it on time. Most days. The morning everything changed, he didn't. Gerald Whitfield had been teaching advanced combinatorial theory at Whitmore for 25 years. In that time, exactly 4 students had received an A in his course. He kept their names on a small index card in his desk drawer, not out of pride for them, but out of pride for himself. His standards were the standard. Everyone else was simply below it. He was 58, thin, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of man who ironed his shirts twice and still found a crease to complain about. He spoke in a measured baritone that never rose, never rushed. He didn't need to raise his voice. The silence in his classroom was automatic, earned through years of quiet brutality. A wrong answer didn't get a correction. It got a pause, a look, then a sentence that made the student wish they'd never raised their hand. Interesting attempt. Perhaps try the introductory course down the hall. That was his style. Surgical. No yelling. Just a blade so thin you didn't feel it until you were already bleeding. He had tenure. He had publications. He had a corner office with a window that overlooked the quad. And he had opinions about who belonged in that office, in that classroom, in that university. Opinions he never said out loud but wore like cologne. Everyone could smell it. Nobody mentioned it. When the department admitted more students through diversity scholarships 3 years ago, Whitfield had signed the faculty letter of support. He had smiled in the photo. And then, in the faculty lounge, he had told his colleague Richard Groves, "We'll see how long that lasts. Preparation isn't something you can legislate." Groves had laughed. Neither of them thought anyone heard. But Dr. Linda Crawford, the adjunct who shared the office next door, heard every word through the wall. She never said anything. She was up for contract renewal. She couldn't afford to. That was how it worked in Whitfield's orbit. People knew. People adjusted. People looked the other way. Samuel Porter had been in Whitfield's class for 11 weeks. In that time, Whitfield had called him Porter exactly twice. Both times when Samuel answered a question correctly, and both times with the same faint surprise in his voice, as if a dog had suddenly solved a crossword puzzle. Every other student got called by their first name. "Good work, Emily." "That's close, Nathan." Samuel got a surname and a raised eyebrow. He noticed. He never said anything. He just sat in the second row, showed up with his notebook, and did the work. His grades were the third highest in the class. He would have been first if Whitfield hadn't docked him for insufficient rigor on 2 problem sets, a comment he never wrote on anyone else's paper. Samuel kept those papers, folded them in half, and tucked them into the back of his notebook. He didn't know why. Something in him said to keep them. The morning of October 14th started wrong and got worse. Samuel's shift at Henderson ran 40 minutes over because a container arrived late, and Gary told the crew nobody was leaving until it was unloaded. He got back to the dorm at 5:40, set his alarm for 8:15, fell asleep with his boots still on. He didn't hear the alarm. His roommate, Terrence Walsh, shook him awake at 9:12. Sam, you got Whitfield in 3 minutes, man." Samuel was out the door in 90 seconds. No shower. Same clothes from the warehouse. Dark jeans, gray hoodie, the smell of cardboard and packing tape still on his skin. He ran across the quad, cut through the science building courtyard, up the stairs of Hargrove Hall, down the corridor to room 310. He opened the door at 9:15. 200 heads turned. Whitfield was mid-sentence. He stopped, looked at Samuel the way a man looks at a stain on a white tablecloth. And in that silence, something shifted. Something small and irreversible. The kind of moment that doesn't announce itself, it just detonates weeks later when you finally understand what it set in motion. The room was still when Samuel stepped inside. 200 students sat in tiered rows, notebooks open, pens frozen. The air had that particular weight it gets when someone has just walked into a place they were not supposed to be, or at least a place where someone powerful had decided they didn't belong. Whitfield stood at the front, chalk in hand, mid-diagram. He didn't finish the line. He just let the chalk hover above the board and turned his head slowly, the way a man turns when he already knows what he's going to see and has already decided how he feels about it. "Mr. Porter." Samuel stopped at the end of the third row. "Professor, I'm sorry. My shift ran over and—" "Your shift." Whitfield set the chalk down on the tray, gently, deliberately. "You know, Porter, I've been teaching this course for 25 years, and in all that time I've had exactly one type of student who can't seem to respect a 9 o'clock start time." He didn't say what type. He didn't need to. The room understood. "Sir, it won't happen again." "No, it won't." Whitfield walked to the far side of the chalkboard, the section he hadn't used for the lecture. Two problems were already written there. Dense notation, multi-line, the kind of problems that looked less like homework and more like a message in a language only a few people on Earth could read. Samuel didn't know it, but those problems had been on that board since the previous afternoon. Whitfield had written them for a meeting with a visiting colleague, Dr. Richard Talbot from Columbia, to discuss a pair of open conjectures in additive combinatorics that had resisted every proof attempt since 2003. 21 years, dozens of published papers trying different angles. None of them cracked it. Whitfield himself had spent 7 years circling problem 2 and had nothing to show for it but a drawer full of dead-end drafts. They were not homework. They were not exam questions. They were unsolved. But Samuel didn't know any of that. He saw 2 math problems on a chalkboard in a math class, and his brain did what it always did. It started working. Whitfield pointed, "Come to the board." Samuel didn't move. "Now, Porter, you wanted to be in this class so badly that you couldn't bother arriving on time. So prove it. Solve these 2 problems, right here, in front of everyone." He paused, let the silence do its work, then added louder so the back rows could hear, "Consider it your punishment." A ripple went through the room. A few students exchanged glances. One girl in the 4th row, Amanda Cleary, pre-med, someone who had never spoken to Samuel but had watched him answer questions all semester, closed her notebook and looked at the floor. She knew what this was. Everyone knew what this was. It wasn't a test. It was a performance. The kind of public correction designed not to teach, but to break. Whitfield wanted Samuel to stand at that board, chalk in hand, and fail. He wanted 200 witnesses to the failure. He wanted to prove in front of everyone that the kid who came in late and smelled like a warehouse didn't have the right to be there. A guy in the back row, Tyler something, varsity lacrosse, son of an alumnus, whispered to his friend, "This is gonna be brutal." His friend smirked. Neither of them looked away. Nobody looked away. It was the kind of slow-motion wreck that people watch because watching costs them nothing. The walk from the 3rd row to the chalkboard was 32 feet. Samuel would remember it for the rest of his life, not because it was long, but because of what filled it. The sound of his own shoes on the linoleum, the fluorescent hum overhead, the way 200 people can stare at you and still make you feel like you're completely alone. He could feel Whitfield's eyes on his back the whole way, and he could feel what those eyes expected. Hesitation, confusion, surrender. A boy returning to his seat with his head down, proving every assumption right. Samuel walked to the board. He picked up the chalk. It was a fresh stick, white, dry, cool against his fingertips. His hand was steady. His heart was not. He read problem 1, then problem 2. His eyes moved across the notation the way a musician reads a score, not word by word, but in phrases, patterns, shapes. He didn't recognize these problems from any textbook. He didn't recognize them from any homework set. But the structures inside them, the relationships between the variables, the constraints, the symmetry, those he recognized. Those lived in the same neighborhood as the problems he'd been solving on shipping labels at 3 in the morning. He took a breath. Behind him, Whitfield sat down at his desk, crossed his arms, leaned back. The posture of a man who had already written the ending. Samuel put chalk to board and began to write. The first thing Samuel wrote was wrong. He knew it before the chalk finished the stroke. A misread variable. His eyes had jumped ahead and his hand followed. He wiped it with the side of his fist, leaving a pale smear on the dark green surface, and started again. Someone in the 5th row coughed. Someone else shifted in their chair. The small sounds that fill a room when 200 people are waiting for a man to drown. Whitfield watched from his desk. Arms crossed, glasses halfway down his nose. He had the expression of someone who had ordered a meal and was waiting for it to arrive exactly as expected. Samuel blocked it out. He had to. He focused on problem 1. It was a conjecture about partition regularity in additive combinatorics. Specifically, whether a certain class of integer equations could always be solved within any finite coloring of the natural numbers. The notation was dense, but the bones of the problem were familiar. He had seen structures like this before, not in a textbook, not in a lecture, on the back of a shipping label at 2 in the morning, when his hands were still numb from the cold dock and his mind was the only part of him that felt alive. He wrote the first line of his approach, then the second, then a third that connected to the first in a way that surprised even him. A lateral step, pulling in a result from topology that had no obvious business being in a combinatorics proof. But it fit. The way a key fits a lock you didn't know existed. 5 minutes. 10. The chalk moved faster. Amanda Cleary, the girl who had closed her notebook, opened it again. She wasn't following the math, she was watching his hand. The way it never hesitated once it found its rhythm. She would later describe it to a campus journalist as like watching someone write in a language they'd been speaking in their dreams for years. At the 15-minute mark, Samuel stepped back from problem 1. He set the chalk on the tray, looked at what he had written. 6 lines of tight, interconnected logic that spanned the left third of the board. He checked the final step against the original constraints, nodded once to himself, picked up the chalk, and moved to problem 2. This one was harder. He could feel it immediately, the way you feel altitude when you climb. The air thins, the steps get heavier. Problem 2 was a generalization question. Could a specific combinatorial identity be extended to higher dimensions while preserving its asymptotic bounds? Whitfield had spent 7 years on this. Talbot at Columbia had co-authored 3 papers trying to crack adjacent versions of it. None of them had reached a clean result. Samuel stood still for almost 3 minutes. His eyes were open but unfocused. His left hand hung at his side. His right hand held the chalk loosely, like a cigarette between thoughts. The room was so silent that someone in the back row could hear the clock on the wall ticking. Tyler, the lacrosse kid, leaned forward. He wasn't smirking anymore. Then Samuel's hand moved. Not slowly this time, fast. He wrote a line, circled a term, drew an arrow to a new expression. Then another. Then another. He was building something. A scaffold of logic that bent the problem into a shape no one in that room, including Whitfield, had ever considered. He used a mapping between partition sets and simplicial complexes, a cross-domain bridge that was either brilliant or insane, and for 40 seconds, nobody in the room could tell which. At the 40-minute mark, the scaffold resolved. The final line clicked into place like the last number in a combination lock. Samuel wrote the concluding statement, set down the chalk, stepped back. The board was full. Both sides. 2 problems. 2 complete solutions. He turned around and faced the room. Nobody moved. Nobody clapped. Nobody said a word. The silence wasn't empty. It was pressurized. The kind of silence that happens when 200 people realize all at once that they just watched something they don't fully understand but know, in their bones, was extraordinary. Samuel looked at Whitfield. Whitfield was not leaning back anymore. He was not smiling. His arms had uncrossed at some point. He couldn't remember when, and his hands were flat on the desk. His face was the color of chalk dust. He said nothing. Samuel walked back to his seat, sat down, and opened his notebook to a fresh page. Whitfield didn't speak for the rest of the class. He stood up from his desk 3 minutes after Samuel sat down, walked to the board, and stared at it. He stared the way someone stares at a car accident, not processing, just absorbing. The class watched him. He didn't look back. He ran his index finger along the second line of problem 1, paused at the topological insertion, and pulled his hand away as if the board were hot. Then he dismissed class 20 minutes early. No explanation, just, that's enough for today. 200 students filed out in a hush. A few of them looked at Samuel as they passed. Amanda Cleary slowed at his row, opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, then closed it and kept walking. Most didn't look at all. Samuel packed his notebook, zipped his bag, and walked toward the door like it was any other Tuesday. He almost made it. "Porter!" Whitfield's voice caught him at the threshold. "Stay!" Samuel turned. The room was empty now, just the 2 of them and the full chalkboard. Whitfield was standing directly in front of problem 2, blocking it with his body as if shielding it from view. "Where did you get these solutions?" "I solved them, just now. You watched me." "No." Whitfield shook his head. "Not the way a person shakes their head when they disagree. The way a person shakes their head when reality has just presented something they've decided cannot be real." "No, you didn't. These aren't class problems, Porter. These aren't homework. Do you understand what these are? You put them on the board. Answer the question." "I don't know what they are. I just solved what was up there." Whitfield took off his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, quieter, but not softer. "These are open conjectures, unsolved, for over 20 years. Research teams, real researchers with doctorates and funding and decades of experience have tried and failed. And you're telling me you just walked in off a night shift and cracked both of them in under an hour?" Samuel didn't answer. Not because he was being defiant, because he didn't know what to say. He hadn't known they were unsolved. He hadn't known they were famous. He had just seen 2 problems and done what he always did. The silence in the room had a different weight now. During the lecture, it had been the silence of expectation. This was the silence of 2 men standing on opposite sides of something neither of them had language for. Whitfield put his glasses back on. His jaw was tight. His voice had a new edge. Not the controlled surgical tone from lectures. Something raw, something threatened. "You copied these. You saw them somewhere. Online, in a journal, from another student. I don't know where, but you didn't solve these. You couldn't have." "Professor, I didn't." "I'm going to the Dean of Academic Integrity." Whitfield was already gathering his papers, shoving them into his briefcase with none of his usual precision. His hands were shaking. Barely, but enough. "I'm filing a formal complaint. Academic dishonesty. Plagiarism of research-level work." Samuel felt the ground tilt. "Sir, I solved them. You saw me. I saw a student write things on a board. I didn't see a student think them up on the spot. Those are very different things." Whitfield snapped his briefcase shut. "You'll be hearing from the disciplinary committee." He walked past Samuel without looking at him. His shoulder brushed Samuel's arm, not hard, but not accidentally. At the door, he stopped, turned halfway. "You know what I think, Porter? I think someone handed you those solutions. And I think you thought you were clever enough to pass them off as your own. But this isn't some community college where nobody checks." There it was again, that phrase, community college, the same code, the same message, delivered with the same casual precision. "You don't belong here. You never did." The door closed behind Whitfield. The sound echoed once and died. The hallway swallowed his footsteps. And just like that, the man who had demanded proof was gone, leaving behind the proof he refused to accept. Samuel stood alone in the empty lecture hall. The chalkboard behind him was still full, his handwriting covering both problems in tight, clean lines. The room smelled like old wood and dry erase residue. He pulled out his phone and called Terrence. "Hey, I think I'm in trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Samuel looked at the board one more time. His own handwriting stared back at him like evidence at a crime scene. "The kind I don't understand." The email arrived 2 days later. From Office of Academic Integrity, Whitmore University. Subject: Notice of Formal Hearing. Case number AI-2024-0347. Samuel read it on his phone, sitting on the edge of his dorm bed at 6 in the morning, still in his warehouse clothes. The words blurred and sharpened, blurred and sharpened. He read it 3 times. He was being charged with academic dishonesty. Specifically, plagiarism of research-level mathematical work during an in-class assessment. The complainant was Professor Gerald Whitfield. The hearing was scheduled for October 24th, 10 days away. If found responsible, the sanctions could include suspension, expulsion, or permanent notation on his academic record. Samuel set the phone down, stared at the wall. His roommate Terrence was still asleep. The room was dark except for the blue glow of the phone screen, now face down on the mattress. He could hear his own breathing. He didn't call his mother, not yet, because he knew exactly what she would do. She would panic. and then she would try to find money she didn't have to fix something she didn't understand. Dorothy Porter had spent her whole life solving problems with sacrifice. Samuel didn't want to hand her one she couldn't solve. Instead, he went to the Office of Student Services. A woman named Diane Prescott, mid-50s, kind eyes, the kind of administrator who kept tissues and granola bars in her desk, explained the process. Samuel was entitled to a hearing before a 5-member faculty panel. He could bring an advisor. He could present evidence. He could call witnesses. "Do you have a lawyer?" Diane asked. "No." "A faculty member who can speak on your behalf?" Samuel thought about it. There was no one. He had never been to a professor's office hours outside of Whitfield's class. He didn't have a mentor. He didn't have connections. He had a 3.7 GPA, a warehouse job, and a bus pass. "I'll speak for myself," he said. Diane looked at him for a long moment. She didn't say what she was thinking, but her eyes said it. She'd seen this before. A kid without resources going up against a tenured professor with 25 years of institutional weight behind him. She knew how those hearings usually ended. "Okay," she said. "Let me tell you what to prepare." Over the next 8 days, Samuel built his defense. He worked his shifts. He attended his other classes. He didn't go back to Whitfield's lecture. The dean's office had quietly arranged for him to audit remotely until the case was resolved. He sat in his dorm room and wrote. He wrote a timeline of that morning. What time he left the warehouse, what bus he caught, what time he entered the room. He wrote a description of his approach to both problems, step by step, from first principle to final conclusion. He explained the topological insertion in problem 1. He explained the simplicial complex mapping in problem 2. He wrote it all out in clear, precise prose, as if teaching it to someone who had never seen the problems before. He didn't know if any of it would matter. He didn't know if a room full of professors would look at a 21-year-old warehouse worker's self-taught proof methodology and see what he saw. But he wrote it anyway, the same way he had always worked, alone, at a desk, with nothing but the problem in front of him and the stubborn belief that if the logic was right, the logic was right, no matter who wrote it. The campus, meanwhile, had already made up its mind. Not formally, nothing was official yet, but the rumor network at Whitmore was faster than any committee. By the end of the first week, Samuel's name was attached to a story that had mutated with each retelling. He had cheated. He had been caught red-handed. He had stolen solutions from Whitfield's own research files. One version said he'd hacked into the professor's computer. Another said a friend at another university had fed him the answers through his phone. None of it was true. All of it stuck. Terrence heard it in the dining hall. "They're saying you broke into his office, Sam." "I didn't." "I know that, but they don't care." Samuel kept working. He kept writing. He kept going to the warehouse at 10 and coming back at 5. He didn't argue with anyone. He didn't post anything online. He didn't try to clear his name in public. But on the night of October 22nd, 2 days before the hearing, something changed. Something he didn't know about. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, visiting professor from MIT, specialist in combinatorial number theory, was eating dinner at a Thai restaurant 3 blocks from campus when her phone buzzed. A colleague had forwarded her a photograph, a chalkboard. 2 problems, 2 solutions. She set down her fork and didn't pick it up again for 45 minutes. Eleanor Hayes had been working in combinatorics for 31 years. She had published 92 papers. She had reviewed for every major journal in the field. She had seen brilliance, real brilliance, the kind that changes the direction of a discipline, exactly 3 times in her career. Once at a conference in Kyoto, once in a paper by a colleague at Cambridge who later won the Fields Medal, and now on a photograph of a chalkboard taken by an undergraduate with a cracked phone screen. She called the colleague who had sent the photo. "Where did this come from?" "A student at Whitmore, 3rd year. Did it on the spot during a lecture." "On the spot?" "From what I'm told, yes. Professor tried to humiliate him. It backfired." Hayes was quiet for 10 seconds, then, "Send me everything." By the next morning, she had the full photograph. High resolution, taken from 3 different angles by Amanda Cleary, who had the presence of mind to photograph the board before the janitor could erase it. Hayes printed them out and spread them across her desk in the visiting faculty office, the way a detective spreads evidence across a table. She started with problem 1. The approach was unconventional. That was the first thing she noticed. Standard attempts at this conjecture used Rado's theorem as a starting point and tried to extend it through iterative refinement. Samuel had bypassed Rado entirely. He had come at the problem through a topological lens, treating the integer partitions as elements of a geometric structure, and proving the result by showing it was a necessary consequence of a connectivity property that nobody had thought to check. It was clean, it was correct, and it was the kind of approach that made Hayes sit back in her chair and say to an empty room, "How did he see that?" Problem 2 was more ambitious. The cross-domain mapping, from partition sets to simplicial complexes, was the kind of move that would get rejected in a grant proposal for being too speculative. But Samuel hadn't written a proposal. He had just done it, and it worked. The mapping preserved the asymptotic bounds while generalizing the identity to arbitrary dimensions. The proof was tight, self-contained, and, Hayes checked 3 times, complete. She picked up her phone, called Victor Ashworth at Princeton, read him the key steps of problem 2 over the phone. Silence. Then, "Read that back to me." She did. "Eleanor, that's not an incremental result. That's a new method. If this holds, it applies to the entire Burnside class." She called James Whittaker at Cambridge next. Same reaction, same long pause, same request to hear it again. Whittaker added something Ashworth hadn't. "Whoever wrote this has an instinct I haven't seen in 20 years. On the morning of October 23rd, one day before Samuel's hearing, Dr. Eleanor Hayes walked into the Office of Academic Integrity at Whitmore University and presented a 6-page written assessment. The cover page bore her name, her MIT affiliation, and a single concluding statement that she had typed, deleted, retyped, and finally left as written. These solutions are not only original, but represent a genuine contribution to the field. The approach to problem 2, in particular, introduces a methodology that does not exist in any published literature. This work could not have been plagiarized because it did not exist before the morning of October 14th. She handed it to the committee chair, a constitutional law professor named Dr. Howard Langley, who read the cover page, looked up at her, and said, "You're certain?" "Completely. Would you be willing to say that at the hearing?" Hayes didn't hesitate. "I'll clear my schedule." The hearing was held in Conference Room B of the Administration Building, windowless, oak-paneled, with a long table at the front where 5 faculty members sat in a row. Dr. Howard Langley chaired the panel. Beside him, Dr. Patricia Sims from philosophy, Dr. Alan Cross from engineering, Dr. Maria Vance from biology, and Dr. Keith Rogers from history. Not a single mathematician among them. Whitfield sat at a table to the left, navy suit, papers organized in labeled folders, the preparation of a man building a case, not seeking truth. Samuel sat to the right, alone, a button-down shirt Terrence had ironed that morning, khaki pants from a thrift store. In front of him, a single folder containing his timeline, his step-by-step explanation of both solutions, and his attendance record. Langley opened. "This hearing concerns case AI-2024-0347. Professor Whitfield, you may present your complaint." Whitfield stood, calm, measured. He spoke the way he lectured, with authority and the assumption that the room would follow. "On October 14th, the student Samuel Porter arrived 15 minutes late to my advanced combinatorial theory course. As a corrective measure, I directed him to attempt 2 problems on the chalkboard. These problems are open conjectures in additive combinatorics, unsolved for over 2 decades. Mr. Porter wrote solutions to both. I do not believe these solutions originated with him." He laid out his case. Samuel had no research background, no publication history, no demonstrated capacity for work at this level. The problems were obscure enough that finding them required access to specialized literature Samuel would not have encountered through normal coursework. It is my professional opinion that these solutions were obtained from an external source and reproduced from memory. Langley nodded. Mr. Porter, your response.
Samuel stood.
His hands were shaking. He put them flat on the table to steady them. He spoke quietly, not from uncertainty, because he had never been in a room like this before. I didn't cheat. I didn't copy anything. I didn't know those problems were unsolved. Professor Whitfield told me to solve them as punishment for being late. That's what I did.
He walked the panel through his timeline.
The overnight shift, the late bus, the alarm he slept through. Then he walked them through his approach, why he chose the topological insertion in problem 1, how the simplicial complex mapping in problem 2 came from a pattern he'd noticed while working partition problems on his own. On break, at my warehouse job, on the back of shipping labels. A few panel members exchanged glances at that detail. He finished, sat down, hands still shaking.
Whitfield leaned toward his microphone.
With respect, the committee is not in a position to evaluate the mathematical validity of what Mr. Porter described. What matters is whether it is plausible that a third-year student with no research experience could independently solve problems that have defeated professionals for, if I may. The voice came from the back of the room. Dr. Eleanor Hayes stood from the observer's bench. Gray blazer, black turtleneck. MIT faculty ID on a lanyard. She held a folder thicker than anything else in the room. Langley looked at her. Dr. Hayes, you submitted a written assessment. Would you like to present it? I would. She walked to the front, opened her folder, and for the next 12 minutes she dismantled Whitfield's case with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a teacher. She explained why Samuel's approach to problem 1 was not only correct, but novel. A topological reframing no published paper has attempted. She explained problem 2. She read Ashworth's response from Princeton. She read Whitaker's response from Cambridge. She showed line by line that the methodology was entirely new. It could not have been copied because it did not exist before October 14th. Then she looked at Whitfield, not with anger, with something worse. The calm, absolute certainty of someone who has spent 3 decades in a field and knows exactly what she is looking at. Professor Whitfield, you gave this student 2 of the hardest unsolved problems in our discipline and told him to solve them as punishment. He did, in under an hour. The only dishonesty in this room is the refusal to acknowledge what that means. The room didn't breathe.
Whitfield opened his mouth,
Closed it. For the first time in 25 years of teaching, Gerald Whitfield had nothing to say. The man who had built a career on never being at a loss for words sat in a windowless room and found that every sentence he had prepared, every argument, every insinuation, every carefully constructed doubt had been dismantled so completely that speaking would only make it worse. Langley called for a vote. Unanimous. 5-0. All charges dismissed. Then he added something that was not in the script. He looked at Whitfield and said, the committee will be recommending a separate review of the circumstances under which these problems were assigned, including whether the assignment constituted discriminatory treatment. Whitfield closed his briefcase, left without looking at anyone. Samuel sat at his table for a long time after the room emptied. Then he pulled out his phone and called his mother.
She picked up on the second ring.
Baby, how'd it go? His voice cracked for the first time in 10 days. They said I didn't cheat, Mom. They said I solved them. Dorothy Porter was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she laughed, the kind of laugh that has tears inside it, and said, Baby, I could have told them that. 2 weeks after the hearing, Dr. Eleanor Hayes sat across from Samuel in her temporary office on the 3rd floor of the mathematics building. Between them, 2 mugs of coffee, a printed draft, and a question. Have you ever submitted a paper to an academic journal? Samuel shook his head.
Then this will be your first.
She slid the draft across the desk. I've formatted your solutions into a submission-ready manuscript for the Annals of Combinatorial Theory. Both problems. Full proofs. I've added context and references to position the work within the existing literature, but every line of mathematics in this paper is yours. Samuel looked at the title page. His name was first. Porter, S. Hayes, E.L.
I'm the corresponding author for logistics, Hayes said.
But you're the first author. That matters. And it's correct. This is your work. He picked up the paper. 41 pages. His solutions, which had taken less than an hour on a chalkboard, now lived inside a framework of citations, definitions, and historical context that connected them to decades of prior research. It looked different in print. It looked like it belonged somewhere. "What happens now?" he asked. "Peer review. I've recommended 3 reviewers, all leaders in the field. If they confirm what Ashworth and Whitaker already told me, this gets published. And Samuel, they will confirm it." The paper was submitted on November 8th. The first reviewer returned comments in 6 days. The second in 9. The third, Dr. Elise Thornton from the University of Zurich, one of the most demanding reviewers in combinatorics, returned hers in 11. All 3 recommended publication with minor revisions. Thornton's review included a line that Hayes would later frame and hang in her office. The elegance of the approach to problem 2 is not merely a solution. It is an invitation to rethink how we approach the entire class. The revisions took 4 days. The paper was accepted on December 2nd, fastest turnaround the annals had seen in a decade. While the paper moved through review, things changed at Whitmore. Quietly at first, then not quietly at all. The committee's recommendation triggered a formal investigation into Whitfield's conduct. 3 other students, 2 Black, 1 Latino, came forward with their own accounts of differential treatment in his courses. Docked grades for vague reasons. Comments about preparation and readiness. The same coded language delivered with the same measured tone across multiple semesters. None of them had filed complaints before. None of them had thought it would matter. It mattered now. In January, the university issued its findings. Gerald Whitfield was formally reprimanded. He was removed from his position as department chair. He was required to complete a faculty equity training program. His courses were reassigned for the spring semester. He retained his tenure. The university didn't go that far, but the corner office with the window overlooking the quad was given to someone else. Whitfield made no public statement. He didn't fight it. A colleague in the department, someone who had known him for 15 years, told a reporter from the campus paper that Whitfield had said, one evening in the faculty parking lot, "I was wrong about that kid." Whether he meant it as an admission or just a fact, no one could say. He didn't elaborate. He never spoke about the case again. Samuel, meanwhile, was offered a full scholarship, tuition, room, board, and a research stipend funded by the mathematics department. He quit his job at Henderson Distribution on a Tuesday. Gary, his warehouse supervisor, shook his hand at the loading dock and said, "Always knew you were too smart for this place." Samuel didn't correct him. He just said thank you, the same way he always had. In February, he received an invitation to present his work at the National Conference on Combinatorial Mathematics in Chicago. A 20-minute slot in the main session, the kind of slot usually reserved for tenured researchers and endowed chairs. He would be the youngest presenter by 11 years. On the day of the presentation, he stood backstage and looked out at an auditorium of 600 people. Mathematicians, researchers, department heads, people who had spent their careers on the kinds of problems he had solved on a chalkboard in a wrinkled hoodie. In the front row, in an aisle seat she had reserved 3 weeks in advance, sat Dorothy Porter. It was the first time she had ever set foot in a university auditorium. She was wearing her best dress. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was smiling before he even started. Samuel Porter is 23 now, first year of a PhD program at Whitmore. Same university, different life. His research continues the work Problem 2 started, extending the simplicial complex methodology to broader classes of combinatorial identities. Dr. Hayes is his advisor. She calls him once a week from MIT. He calls her back within the hour, every time. His office is on the 2nd floor of the mathematics building, a small room with a window that looks out over the quad. It used to be a storage closet. He doesn't mind. He's had smaller spaces. He keeps one item that doesn't belong in any academic setting, a single stick of chalk, sealed in a clear plastic case, sitting on the windowsill where the afternoon light catches it. It's the same piece he picked up that morning in Whitfield's class. He doesn't use it. It already did everything it was supposed to do. His mother calls every Sunday. She asks about his week. He tells her about his research. She doesn't pretend to understand it, but she listens to all of it. Every detail. The way she listened when he was 9 and tried to explain long division at the kitchen table. Dorothy Porter never read a mathematics paper, but she understood something that Whitfield, with all his publications and tenure, never did. That the size of someone's talent has nothing to do with the size of their circumstances. Samuel still keeps shipping labels in his desk drawer. Not because he needs them. He has notebooks now, a whiteboard, a tablet. He keeps them because they remind him where the work started. 3 in the morning, a cold loading dock, a pencil stub, and a blank piece of adhesive-backed paper. That's where the ideas lived before anyone thought they mattered. The paper in the Annals of Combinatorial Theory has been cited 31 times in 8 months. Problem 2's methodology has been adopted by 3 research groups working on generalized partition theory. Samuel's name appears in literature reviews next to people who have been publishing for decades. He doesn't think about that much. He thinks about the next problem. Amanda Cleary graduated pre-med. She still has the chalkboard photos on her phone. Terrence Walsh works in tech in Austin. He still calls Samuel every Thursday. Gary retired from Henderson. He framed the university newspaper article, the one with Samuel's photo, and hung it in the warehouse break room next to the fire exit sign. It's still there. And Gerald Whitfield? He still teaches. Quieter now, smaller classes. He never mentions October 14th, but he keeps his chalkboard cleaner than he used to, and he never leaves problems on the board overnight anymore. Some punishments don't work the way they're supposed to. Some of them crack something open instead. And sometimes the kid who walks in 15 minutes late, smelling like cardboard and cold air, is the one who solves the thing nobody else could. Not because he had permission, not because someone believed in him, but because the math didn't care who he was. It just needed someone willing to pick up the chalk. What would you do if someone tried to use your own ability against you? Drop your answer in the comments. If this story hit you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Stories like this don't get told enough.
52 minutes. That's how long it took a kid from a loading dock to solve what an entire field couldn't crack in 20 years. Whitfield had tenure funding, a corner office, and decades of experience. Samuel had a pencil stub and a bag of shipping label, and the map didn't care. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't check your resume. It doesn't ask who your father is or what bus you rode in on. Samuel's mother never read a single math paper, but she knew something Whitfield spent 25 years never learning. You cannot measure what someone is capable of by looking at where they came from. Genius doesn't wait for permission. It just needs someone willing to pick up the chalk. So let me ask you this. If the world only sees your circumstances, does that change what lies inside you? How many people right now are solving extraordinary things in silence, on break, in the dark, and nobody is looking? And when someone finally does look, will they have the courage to see what's actually there? What would you do if someone tried to use your own ability against you? Drop it in the comments. If this story hit you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed, now is the time.